Stories Between Us anthology, where Black queer men's lives, love, and tension take center stage. Daniel loved doors because they obeyed. They separated. They protected. They let you decide what was public and what was private with a simple motion of the hand. In his world, doors mattered more than most people did. The sanctuary doors opened like a promise every Sunday morning, and the side doors stayed shut like a secret. The office door clicked behind him after meetings, a punctuation mark on whatever version of himself he had performed. Even the door of his car, late at night, felt like the last honest boundary he still controlled. That night, the church was still ringing in his ears long after the lights went out. He'd preached on thresholds, on choosing the narrow way, on how temptation didn't start at the sin, but at the handle. He delivered it clean, with the practice urgency that made people nod as if their lives depended on it. The cameras loved him when he spoke like that, steady, compassionate, certain. Naomi had coached him years ago to land his sentences where the audience could breathe, to soften his pauses so they sounded like mercy instead of judgment. He had taken her advice and turned it into a ministry. Now, hours later, he sat in a dark parking lot with the engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant, indifferent hush of the city. The contrast wasn't poetic. It was logistical. Daniel, he was in this car, and Daniel, he was in that pulpit, couldn't exist in the same room. Daniel didn't tell himself he was doing this for excitement. He didn't tell himself he was doing this because he couldn't stop. He told himself he was doing it because it was contained, because it had rules, because he could pay for the kind of privacy prayer had stopped giving him. His phone vibrated with a notification, a voice note prompt, the app's gentle suggestion that words could be softer when you said them instead of typing them. He downloaded it under a different email, a different name, a different face. He never used his real photo. He never used his real voice for anything public. But the first time he'd sent a message on the app, his own breath had startled him like he'd found someone else hiding inside his chest. He kept the car windows cracked just enough to let in air that felt like consequences. He recorded the voice note with his thumb, hovering like a man deciding whether to open a door he already knew would change him. "I'm outside," he said, and hated how calm it sounded. He didn't add please. He didn't add anything that could be mistaken for need. He sent it anyway, then sat perfectly still as if stillness could keep him safe. Across town, Thomas heard the notification while he was rinsing a glass in the sink. This was usually when clients started reaching out. He was a male escort, and nights were when his phone was open for business hours. He didn't live in a place that looked like anyone's fantasy of secrecy. Meeting men after dark didn't pay 6 figures, but his place was a modest 1-bedroom over a quiet business that he was semi-proud of. It had thin walls, so he had soft padding that lined the walls so as to not disturb his neighbors when his clients came over. The lock on his front door worked, and the peephole was reliable, which in his life counted as luxury. He dried his hands slowly from washing dishes. The app he communicated with clients on had changed the rhythm of his nights. Clients used it to reach out with blunt messages, asking about availability, price, and location, like Thomas was a service and not a real person. The voice notes made them sound human before they arrived, which was sometimes worse. You could hear hesitation in a man's throat. You could hear arrogance disguised as charm. You could hear loneliness like a hum behind every sentence. With some clients, Thomas insisted on typed messages only. With others, he preferred voice, because voice told the truth, even when words lied. Daniel, he didn't know him as Daniel, not officially, was the kind who insisted on a voice, but never at first. At first it was always short messages, clipped and careful, like he was afraid a longer sentence might accidentally become a confession. Then, over time, the voice notes got longer. The pauses got more deliberate. The breaths started to sound less like caution and more like someone trying to remember how to want something without apologizing for it. Thomas didn't open the door immediately. He never opened the door immediately for anyone, even the clients he liked, especially not for the ones he liked. His apartment door was the only thing in his life that belonged to him all the way. Behind it, he wasn't performing. He wasn't selling fantasies for men with money. He wasn't guessing what someone would take from him. He was just a man in socks on a clean floor, deciding what kind of night he was going to let happen. He listened to the voice note once, then again. I'm outside. Not demanding. Not pleading. Controlled in a way that made Thomas curious, because control always cost something. He walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw a man standing in the hallway with his shoulders squared like he was bracing for impact. Daniel's face was angled down, hat low, as if the hallway itself might recognize him. Thomas could only see part of him, but he knew the shape of that restraint now. He knew the discipline of a man who'd been trained to contain himself and punished whenever he failed. Thomas placed his hand on the lock and paused, not for suspense, but for clarity. Every time he opened this door, he chose something. Sometimes he chose money over rest. Sometimes he chose risk over boredom. Sometimes he chose the proximity of a man's body over the peace of being alone. Tonight, he chose the truth that lived in how Daniel waited without knocking. He turned the lock and opened the door. The hallway light spilled into the apartment like it had permission. Daniel stepped in quickly, as if being seen in the threshold was the most dangerous part. Thomas closed the door behind him and let the click land clean and unmistakable. The door wasn't symbolism to Thomas. It was policy. It was a line. It was his only altar. Inside, Daniel removed his shoes without being asked. The same ritual every time. Thomas watched him do it and wondered what kind of life required this much self-erasure before you even spoke. Daniel's gaze lifted briefly, met Thomas's, then dropped again, as if eye contact might count as intimacy, and intimacy might count as debt. Thomas kept his voice steady, neutral, professional in the way he'd learned to use it when he needed to stay in control. He didn't rush to get close to him. He didn't offer the usual comforts. He let the space between them be the thing that heated first. Daniel, the name Thomas didn't know, stood with his hands at his sides, fingers flexing once, as if he'd been holding on to something invisible the whole drive over. Then Daniel spoke, soft enough that Thomas had to lean in just a fraction to hear him. I don't want this to feel like a transaction tonight. He stopped, as though he wanted to say more. But finishing his thought would make this moment too real. The unfinished thought hung in the room like a sharp fragrance. Thomas didn't rescue him from it either. He'd learned that people told you who they were when you let them struggle a little. Instead, he simply nodded toward the interior of the apartment, offering direction without special invitation. Come on in, he said, and meant it literally. Past the threshold, out of the hallway, away from the public world where people could be overheard. Daniel stepped forward, and Thomas felt the shift the way you feel a door close behind you. The air changes. The rules change. The person changes. The hallway was gone now. Whatever he'd been outside, he was inside. And inside was where men like this either unraveled or hardened into something cruel. When Daniel lifted his head, he didn't straighten. His shoulders stayed rounded, his hands loose at his sides. His eyes were red at the edges. He looked at Thomas and held his gaze. When he spoke, his voice landed low and steady, fuller than it had sounded in the voice notes. Thomas felt it register immediately, heat settling in his body even as he kept his face neutral. Thomas's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit with a forwarded message from a friend. It was a live stream from a church account he didn't follow. It was a video. A preacher at a pulpit under bright lights, confident and composed. The caption mentioned something about doors, salvation, and the narrow way. The voice coming from Daniel in front of him matched the one in the video exactly. Thomas didn't touch his phone. He watched Daniel in front of him with the same voice he'd heard in the messages. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Thomas shifted his weight forward slightly, his attention fixed on Daniel. It was the look that said this man's deposit had cleared, and the night no longer belonged to God. Thomas moved first. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward at an even pace and stopped where Daniel had to adjust his posture to keep looking up at him. The change was immediate. Daniel's shoulders tightened. His breathing slowed. Daniel sat on the edge of the sit instead of leaning back. His coat stayed on. His knees remained apart. His hands rested flat on his thighs, still and open. It was not a relaxed position. It was a careful one. The kind used by men who expected rules. Thomas stayed standing. From here, he could hear Daniel breathe. Each breath was measured, controlled, released on purpose. The same pattern Thomas had heard in the voice notes. The same pace, the same restraint. This was not nerves. It was practice. The silence held. Then Daniel gave his name. He said it plainly. No pause, no explanation. It landed with weight, like a name he was used to having taken seriously. Thomas noted it and gave his own, short and direct as well, enough to keep the energy balanced. Daniel repeated it quietly, as if confirming it before letting it settle. They stayed that way for a moment, the door locked behind them, with the rest of the city reduced to distant sound. Thomas stepped closer and stopped just in front of Daniel's knees. He did not touch him. He did not need to. This was the point where Thomas took control. He laid out the terms of the night clearly. Daniel followed each rule with his eyes. He did not interrupt. He did not negotiate. He absorbed the terms the way men do when they already understand the price. When Thomas finished, he straightened. Thomas went to the side table and opened the drawer. He took out his work bag first, the small black one he kept stocked and ready. Inside were the usual things: wipes, sanitizer, condoms, lube, a clean towel folded tight, breath mints, everything lined up the way he preferred. He set it on the table, unzipped it, and left it open. Daniel reached for his wallet immediately. His hands were steady now, certain that he wanted this to happen. Money moved easily for him, like this part of the exchange was familiar. Thomas counted the bills carefully. Not because he doubted him, because the process mattered. He always wanted clients to know it was about the money and not them. He folded the money and set it aside. Only then did he look at Daniel directly. The pastor met his eyes. Their roles settled into place. This was now an agreement. Daniel finally removed his coat, shifting his shoulders as if shedding the last piece of armor he'd worn outside. He placed it neatly over the back of the chair instead of dropping it, smoothing the fabric once with his palm before letting his hand fall away. Even this, Thomas noted, was done with care. Nothing about him was careless. Not his movements, not his attention, not the way he waited. Thomas didn't rush him either. Something about Daniel made him want to allow him the space to get comfortable. He stayed where he was and let the moment stretch. Men often filled silence when they were nervous. Daniel did not. He held himself together. The voice that commanded a megachurch had gone quiet, and the quiet obeyed him just as easily. Thomas reached into the open bag and began setting things out in order. Not for show, for control. Each item placed with intention, each movement unhurried. Wipes first, then sanitizer, a folded towel. The lube, set upright where it wouldn't tip, everything visible, everything accounted for. The routine did not require explanation. Daniel watched without comment. His gaze followed Thomas's hands, the way they moved with certainty, the way the night took shape around them piece by piece. This was not curiosity. This was focus, the kind built from long habits of listening rather than acting. The room felt different with the door locked and the coat gone. Smaller, more deliberate. The outside world had been reduced to noise that no longer mattered. Thomas stepped closer, close enough to be felt. Daniel did not lean back. He did not lean forward. He stayed still, as if waiting for instruction. This posture was familiar to Thomas. Men who lived in positions of authority often struggled when that same authority was taken from them. Daniel did not struggle. He seemed to adapt. Thomas reached out and adjusted the towel where it rested on the table, aligning the edge. It was an unnecessary movement, but he did it anyway. The control was part of the work. Daniel spoke only after Thomas allowed it. His shoulders stayed level. His hands rested where Thomas had left them, open and still. The room was quiet enough that his breath was audible when he drew it in. Thomas stood near the table, close enough to be obeyed. He was in full master mode, and he was ready to make Daniel his godly submissive. Daniel began with a sentence he had used 100 times before. Don't move unless I tell you to. This was his first commandment to Pastor Daniel. Thomas lifted one hand to signal not to move unless he saw that signal. Daniel's eyes got big. He felt himself loosen, like that commandment snapped him into another version of himself. Thomas lowered his hand. The muscles in Daniel's jaw tightened. His throat opened, his body letting him know the truth of what he wanted. His body was built to be hidden. Most days it lived under layers of heavy fabric and careful tailoring, under church robes cut to fall straight and wide, designed to erase shape and suggestion. From the pulpit, he was meant to look solid and distant, broad but undefined, a figure rather than a man. The weight of those clothes kept everything in place, chest lifted, stomach held tight, shoulders squared, nothing soft allowed to show, nothing human meant to distract from the message. Here, stripped down to thin fabric and bare lines, his discipline showed in different ways. His shoulders remained wide, but they no longer carried the burden of standing tall for anyone else. The tension that usually locked them back had slipped forward, just enough to change how he occupied the room. His chest rose and fell without ceremony now. deeper than it ever did behind a microphone, the breath slower, less controlled. The careful stillness he practiced while preaching had given way to small, involuntary movements, a tightening in his abdomen, a shift in his thighs, the subtle flex of his hands as they rested open and waiting. When he preached, his body worked like a machine built for endurance, jaw steady, voice lifted from the chest, breath taken in clean, measured pulls between sentences. Every movement rehearsed to look effortless, holy, untouched by need. Here, his body answered before his mouth could. The pulse in his neck beat visibly. His stomach tightened when Thomas stepped closer. His breathing lost its symmetry. The control he exercised in front of thousands dissolved into something more private, more deviant. He was no longer responsible for carrying belief, no longer tasked with standing upright for anyone else's salvation. He did not have to hold himself together. The permission to release that weight showed in the way his spine eased, in the way his head lowered without instruction when Thomas told him where to place his lips, in the way his body leaned toward stillness instead of authority. Everything about him waited to be directed. For the first time in years, his body was not preparing to deliver anything. It was listening. And in that listening, Pastor Daniel allowed himself to want without shaping it into prayer, without turning it into performance, without asking forgiveness for it afterward. He remained still. Not because he was told to, because he no longer needed to stand. With each commandment, Thomas gave Daniel obeyed. He obeyed all night long. It was Sunday morning, 2 days since he had last been in Thomas's room, and Daniel was back in his church robes. Daniel stood where he always stood. The pulpit was familiar under his hands, smooth from years of use. The lights were set the way he preferred them, bright enough to see faces, soft enough to forgive. The congregation settled into their seats with the practiced quiet of people who trusted him to lead them somewhere safe. Naomi sat 3 rows back, tablet in her lap, eyes already on him before he spoke. She ran communications for the church, managed the pastor's public schedule, and cleaned up problems before they reached the congregation. She knew his voice, his timing, and his habits well enough to hear when something was off. He opened his sermon with the same posture he had used for years. Shoulders back, feet planted, chin lifted just enough to carry authority without arrogance. His robe hung heavy from his frame, concealing the lines of his body, returning him to the shape his congregation expected. The fabric did its work. It flattened impulse. It made him large and distant again. His voice was strong at first. He greeted the room. He named the scripture. He let the first pause stretch just long enough to draw everyone in. His cadence returned easily, muscle memory taking over, breath rising and falling where it was supposed to. The sound filled the space the way it always did. Then his voice slowed. The next sentence took longer for him to say. His body started to hesitate as if waiting for something else to happen. A few heads lifted in the crowd. Naomi glanced down at her tablet, then back up. Pastor Daniel started to hear Thomas's voice inside his mind without warning. He tried to move into the body of the sermon he was preaching, the part he usually enjoyed most. This was where he could build, where his voice could rise and fall with intention, where the room followed him willingly. But instead, his throat tightened, closing around a memory of Thomas the Escort commanding him to stop and only move or breathe when he allowed. Daniel continued, but the sermon no longer flowed. It moved in short sections now, broken by flashbacks that came too often. He managed to finish the sermon without collapse. The congregation stood. Applause followed, polite and sincere, threaded with some confusion. Pastor Daniel stepped back from the pulpit and bowed his head, closing the moment the way he always did, slower than usual. Naomi watched him closely as he left the stage. He accepted greetings in the aisle with practiced warmth, but his eyes drifted once, twice, toward nothing in particular, as if listening for something only he could hear. Near the exit, a small group of women leaned together, voices low, glancing back toward the stage. They were gossiping about the pastor's weird behavior during the sermon. Naomi reached them before they noticed her. She stopped beside them and said, "If you're reviewing sermons, send your notes to the main office like everyone else." The women straightened. Someone laughed. Someone else pretended to check her phone. Naomi smiled once and walked on. Back in the pastor's office, the door closed behind him. Daniel sat heavily in his chair. He loosened his collar. His phone was already in his hand before he noticed picking it up. He opened the app. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked the phone and set it face down on the desk. An hour later, long after the building had emptied, he sat in his car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, the echo of his own sermon still lodged in his chest like unfinished business. He opened the app again. This time he decided to send a voice note to Thomas. The reply from Thomas came less than a minute later. Thomas's voice filled the car, calm and certain, telling him yes, telling him he had done well, telling him to be a good boy and come now. Daniel started the engine. That night, he did not wait for permission. He went. Daniel was already inside the apartment when Thomas closed the door. He had moved to the center of the room without being told, coat folded, shoes set neatly aside, his body arranged in the posture Thomas had taught him to take when he did not want to speak. Knees on the floor, head lowered, back still, waiting. Thomas watched from the doorway for a moment before locking it. Daniel did not look up. He stayed where he was, hands resting open on the floor, shoulders steady, breath slow enough to count. Thomas crossed the room and stopped a few steps behind him. Daniel felt it immediately. His body was directly on his back. Thomas stood close enough for Daniel to feel him behind him. Daniel's back straightened on instinct. He did not turn. Thomas did not touch him. He told him to stay where he was. The room was quiet, but not sharp the way it usually was. It did not feel like a test. It felt like the end of a long day, the kind that made a man tired in places sleep could not reach. Thomas walked around him slowly, his footsteps clear on the floor, giving Daniel time to register where he was without seeing him. He stopped in front of him. He told Daniel to look up. He told Daniel this night was not about taking anything else from him. Tonight, Thomas wanted Pastor Daniel to dominate him. Tonight, he wanted to be taken to his own kind of church service, and he was giving Daniel the chance to feel power in a new way. And for the first time in days, Daniel's body relaxed and was open again. What neither of them said out loud in that moment was they actually enjoyed this dynamic, both of them sharing power and submission. When Thomas finally stepped back and gave him the space, Daniel did not shrink into it. That was the surprise. It came to him naturally. Thomas had come to surrender quite naturally as well, while Pastor Daniel discovered that dominance did not have to be loud to be real. You might expect a man like him to fall apart under the weight of a double life. The sermons, the crowds, the silence, the rules. But the truth was simpler than that. Some men confess. Some men disappear. And some men learn how to place their hunger somewhere it does not destroy them. Daniel chose the last one. On Sundays, he preached and stood tall. He carried other people's faith like it belonged to him. But on certain nights, behind one locked door in a quiet building, he let another part of himself stand just as fully, not to be forgiven, not to be saved, but to be used with consent and answered with trust. Thomas did not take his faith. He gave him balance. The church never noticed the difference, but Pastor Daniel did. And it was enough to keep him whole. Thank you for listening to Stories Between Us Anthology. You can find every episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Rate the show and leave a comment. It helps more people find us.